Okay, so moving on, I'm just going to hide the character, hide the grid, and we'll start with the IK and FK switch. So what we want to do in here is bring up, so I'll go to Window, Render and Editors, Hypershade again, and we're just going to look at how we can set up this IK FK switch. So we'll select the IK FK curve, go to Graph, add selected to Graph, and we'll work on the left hand side first, and then we'll just repeat the same steps on the right. So all I'm going to do is start adding these controls. So I'm going to add the both FK controls and this IK control, this IK handle, and just go to Graph, add selected to Graph. And what we need to do in here is basically, like we said earlier, switching the IK FK blend to 0 and 1 is switching the IK on and off. So if we think, what we're going to do is we're going to set IK to IK 0. So when this is set to 0, we want that IK blend to be set to 1. So one way we can do this is we can minimize, click and drag and drop, go to Other, and we could manually just click the left arm onto the IK FK switch, IK blend. But this isn't going to work because we wanted a 0 for IK. So when it's IK, it's set to 0 in here, but actually we want it set to 1 in here. So connecting these directly isn't going to work. So what we actually need to do is we could use a set driven key. So for this, what we can do is go to Windows. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways we can do this. We can have if we make sure we're in the animation, go to Animate, set driven key, and set. And we're going to use this quite a lot later on for the fingers. So what we can do is load driver, which will be the IK FK curve, load driven, which will be the IK handle. And we're basically, a set driven key is a way that you can set values to control other values, but they don't have to be directionally in proportion. So we could say, so 0 in here actually means 1, and then 1 in here means 0, and it's going to blend between those two values. So what we're going to do is select the left IK FK, make sure it's set to 0, select the IK, we're going to scroll down to the IK blend and set that to 1. And with the left arm selected and then IK blend selected here, we can hit key. And this actually adds a keyframe. So it's not keyframe data that's going to go on your timeline, but it is treated the same way as keyframe data. And now what we can do is, if we select the global IK and FK control, switch this to 1, select the IK FK blend, switch this to 0, and key. And I can close this now. And basically what's happening now is, I'll just select this. So I'm going to select all these curves and just graph the network. And networks are going to build up quite quickly when you start adding constraints and different things and start skinning. So don't be too daunted if you see quite a lot of things in here. So I'm just going to drag these off to the side and see if we can find out what's going on. And one thing we said earlier, that set driven key, that's the keyframe data. So if we look at the icons on here, keyframe data, as we know, is a graph. So like the graph editor, setting the keyframe. So we can see here that actually, if we hover over this arrow, it's saying input is the IK FK, and it goes to the IK blend of this graph, and then that in turn goes to the IK FK blend. So we can see that this is the actual set driven key. And if we double click on that, we can bring up the attribute editor to see those keys that we actually set. And you can do the same, you can change the values in here, you can change the tangents, and we can actually go to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, and we can actually see, with this selected, it is actually animation data in a graph. So you could we could now actually start to edit these keys and move them about. So one thing I'm actually going to do in here straight away is set this to linear. And the reason I'm doing that is because if it's set to smooth in and out, which you usually do want, but if you key that IK/FK control, then you will be keying it in the IK/FK control in its graph editor. So that's going to have a smooth in and out for that IK/FK blend attribute, which in turn is driving this graph, which also has a smooth in and out. So it's multiplying the amount of smoothing in and smoothing out. So with the set different key, in my opinion, it's usually best to set it to linear. And that way, so say like here, 0.1. If we go to 0.1 on the graph and go up, we can see that actually, if I set a value of 0.1 in the IK/FK switch, it is not giving me the correct value because we have this smooth in and out. So by setting it to linear, you can see that it's going to blend straight from one to the other. So I know if I set a 0.1 value, I'm at a 0.1 on that graph. There's no sort of smooth in and out. So that's a bit about how the set different key will work. So next what we'll need to do, so the IK is working, the IK we can switch it on and off. The next thing we need to do is switch the two curves on and off. So I'm going to select these two curves and just graph them. And I'm going to move these down. And we can see here, there's, if you hover over these, it'll give you the name. And this is the orient constraint. So again, constraint to these little exclamation marks. And I'm going to move this down because this is what we'll need. And the next one is this multiply divide node that we set up earlier for the twist distribution of that double elbow. So what we're going to do in here now is I'm taking the relevant things down here, and we can actually just select these and go graph, remove selected from graph, just to get rid of them. It doesn't delete them, and you never want to actually press delete because that will physically delete them and that will screw up your rig. But just going graph, remove selected from graph just hides them. So they still exist, we've just hidden them from the graph so we can concentrate on these down here. And I'll do the same, select the IK/FK control, graph, add selected to graph. So for the first one, because it's a simple orient constraint, if we select the orient constraint, we can see in the channel box editor it has a weight value. So it's usually the last attribute. It's got the name and then a W0, which is the weight, and it's currently set to 1, which means the constraint is on, the orient constraint is on. So what I want is, I want to set this to 0 when the IK switch is on. So I'm going to do, and instead of doing the same with the IK/FK, we don't actually need to invert this, because when this is 0, we are in IK. So I want this to be 0 as well. So what we could actually do is drag and drop, middle mouse click, drag and drop onto the constraint, go to other. So on the left we've got the IK and FK control, to the right we've got the orient constraint. I'm just going to scroll down, it should be at the bottom, left arm IK/FK, and that's going to drive the CC underscore left arm FK01 W0 for weight. And then hit close. So now we can see there's a connection there because it's yellow. It says 0. So if we set this to 1, you can see now it's put that value across. So what we can start to do actually is, if I move this IK/FK control, this wrist control, select the IK/FK and start to blend this, you can see how now we're getting that nice blend between those two controls. And we can see if I rotate this back, the rotation's working, the FK control's working. So I'll rotate that up, setting the IK and FK control down here. You can see it's blending between those two. So it's switching the orient constraint off and switching the IK on. And the result of that is it's going to smoothly blend between those two values. Now all we need to do is deal with this double joint here. And usually you can do the same as we did before. You might have some orient constraints in here. So if you used orient constraints, you could do the same that you did with this orient constraint, just key it to set it off. But what we actually did was we used this graph network, this multiply divide node, and we can't simply switch this off. So what we actually want to do is we want to blend between two values, and the values are going to be 0, which will be no effect, and then the second value will be this IK and FK. So to do that, if I click the creation bar and search for blend, and you can see a blend color node. And again, these are all sort of shader nodes, so it's like blend color. It seems like it's to do with something with color, but if we double click on that, so what it actually is it's got a blender attribute and two colors. And like what we said before, color is RGB. So RGB is just free values. So those free values can be anything really. It doesn't have to be a color. And in this case, we're going to use those as rotates. So if we go to the channel box edit, we can see yep, it's free values here, R, G, and B. And we're going to use this as X, Y, and Z. And you can see this consistency down here. This little representation of the grid. Oops. You can see the Y, X, Y, and Z is actually R, G, and B. So it just makes sense. So what we're actually going to do here then is we're going to again select the IKFK control, drop it onto the blend color node, go to Other, and I'm going to set the IKFK to Blender. And what that means is basically the blender is there's an if true and if false value. So the first value, there's a color 1 and a color 2. So when it's set to 0, and to demonstrate this properly, what we can actually do is I'm going to create a sphere, and I'll give it a surface shader, and with this blend color node I'm just going to select the surface shader, drag, and we can actually drop it on the attribute editor on the out color. And I'll just move this down. So what we can actually do here is if I press 6 to go to texture view, we can see here that when it's set to 0, it is choosing color 2. When it's set to 1, so because we connected it up, it blends to the first color, which is red. And you can see how it's blending between those two R, G, and B values. So in our case, that's going to be the rotation, the X, Y, and Z. So we just want to check that when it's at 0, and 0, if we check again on the IK control, is actually IK, so 0 means IK. So 0 is the blue on this, so blue is IK mode. So on IK mode, we're going to set these to 0, which means the rotate has no effect. So I'm just going to delete the sphere and the shader node, the surface shader we made, because we don't need him anymore. But just as a side note, you can actually use these as even more visual aids. You could have a NURB surface that was parented to this control down here, so as you switch IK and FK on or switch stretch limbs on, different spheres down here could change a different colour, so the animator can physically see that colour changing, so they can just look down at the bottom. If it's red, it's IK, if it's blue, it's FK, something like that. But for the moment I'm just going to delete these because I don't need them. So the colour true value, so if the second value is 0 for the IK, we want the first value to actually be the output, so the FK of this. So all we're going to do is middle mouse click and drag, go to Other, and I'm going to take the output of the multiply divide node and put it into the colour 1 and hit close. So that means whatever FK rotations we're getting out of this curve, we are halving and then sending it to the colour, so the first colour of this, and then we're going to send that back to these two joints. So instead of going from straight the multiply divide to the joints, we're putting this in the middle so we can switch it on and off. So we can switch it off when we're in IK mode. So all I need to do now is middle mouse click and drag, go to other, and we'll select the output, and we'll put that into the rotate. And it's sometimes hard to see because we did actually constrain the rotate up, so you can see it's been greyed out. But if we click that, it's just going to override those previous connections we made. And then keeping this up, I'm just going to select the next joint, reload right, which is just going to load the other joint in, and it's still got output selected, and hit rotate and hit close. So now what that means is we can move this FK control down here. These rotates aren't going to do anything because we're in IK mode at the moment. With the IK FK control selected, I can now rotate between those two IK and FK controls. So we can see how quite quickly we've been able to just set up those two systems and set up a way of blending between those two. And in a later tutorial we're going to go through how we can make this seamless with a bit of mel coding and changing it, but for the moment this is going to work quite well for us. And one other thing we'll notice that if we're working in IK, these are sort of clogging up the scene. We don't want to see this going on over here, we don't want to see the FK controls. So what we can actually do here, I'm just going to reset these all back to 0, is we're going to set up another set different key so that when this is set to 0, so actually what we're going to do, so we'll get these two FK controls here, get the IK FK control, and we're going to middle mouse drag and drop, go to other, so when it's in 0 it's in IK mode. So what we can actually do is set that to the visibility of this IK FK control. And it might be quite hard to find, so we've just got to look through it for a while, and then we can see visibility. We'll add it in there, and you can see it disappears. And we'll do the same with the forearm, reload right, visibility. So this basically means when we're in IK, which is a value of 0, it sends a value of 0 to the visibility of those two controls. If we're in FK, we can see we're at 1. So the visibility is 1, we can see the controls. And this way, the animator can only see the controls that they should be working with. So if they're in IK, they can only see the IK controls. If they're in FK, they can only see the FK controls. And furthermore, what we'll do in here is we can set up the same with these two controls here. So we're just going to select the two IK controls, go to graph, add selected to graph, and we could set up another set driven key for each of these, so when it's at 0 these are on, when it's at 1 these are off. But what we can actually do is we've already got a set driven key set up with this IK control. So if I select the IK, select those two curves and just graph selected, and I'll move them off to the side, and we're going to look for that graph node again, so the set driven key, and then all these nodes over here that we don't want to deal with, we can just go graph remove selected again, and then we don't need to re-add that at the moment. So the IK and FK is controlling this set driven key, which in turn's controlling the IK FK. But what we can actually do is, instead of setting up a set driven key which would set up 3 of these graph nodes, because they're all doing the exact same thing, you can see in here the output, so dot output of this graph is going into the IK FK blend. So all we're going to do is take the dot output of this and put it into the visibility of these two. So this way we're just avoiding adding 2 extra set driven key nodes. So middle mouse click, drag and drop, go to other, we're taking the output and we are putting it in. And also one thing you'll notice in here, just to quickly see, is you can see that it's slanted slightly, it's like italic, and that's telling us it's connected up. And in here we can see that output is slightly italic. So this is the way that we can tell that this graph, this node, is actually using the output value. So we can tell that that line there is the dot output going into something. So we can just tell that none of these above are connected, so we can tell it's the output that we need to use. So we take the output and we will set it as the curve's visibility. And we can see in here it's actually disappeared as well. And then we'll do the same, select the wrist control, reload right, visibility. And one thing we want to do as well, let's hide the hypershade, is we don't want this display curve anymore. And we can't really select this because we templated it, so we need to select it through the outliner. We'll go to extra nodes, extra to show, and it's the left display. And we can actually see in here it's been a bit bad and we haven't renamed this in here, so just to make sure we've got it right, we'll rename the right one whilst we're here. So we've just got to make sure we're always keeping these names consistent. So selecting the left one, I'm going to reload right and add that, connect the visibility up. So this way you can see now that we're in FK mode. The animator can just visually look at that and go, that arm's in FK, that arm's in IK. So now we can just switch between them, nothing's clogging up the scene, and we just know instantly what's going on. Okay, so in the next tutorial I'm just going to quickly go through again setting this up on the other side. I won't go into as much detail because we're just basically repeating the exact same steps just on the opposite side, but I'm just going to do that just if you want to watch along or if you want to watch every step as it goes along. But if you're comfortable with that, we're just going to be doing the exact same thing on the other side, so you can skip ahead to the next tutorial if you want.